with the ascent of an affirmed climate science denier to the highest office in the land, and with his advisors, including other climate science deniers as well, what will the election of Donald Trump mean for the environment here in North America and for the planet as a whole? Here to discuss that with us now is Dr. Joe Romm. Joe Romm is the founding editor of Climate Progress. He has a scientific background himself, so he speaks from a position of expertise which may not be recognized by our new president, but it's nonetheless valid. And he joins us now. Joe, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. It seems like the title, the name of your show is unbelievably appropriate now.
Yeah, it was. I feel it was appropriate before, perhaps tragically appropriate now, because I do feel, people talk about tipping points and so on. The climate is one of several areas where we seem to reach and pass certain critical tipping points, and maybe that's a good place to start. Immediately before Trump's election, or perhaps on the same day, November 8th, we had a report from, we had a new meteorological report come out saying that we were reaching a new historic levels of climate warming. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is going to be the hottest year on record, and it's going to, crush the previous record, which was set all the way back in 2015. And the 2015 also blew out the previous record for the hottest year on record, which was all the way back in 2014. So, yeah, we're in a serious warming trend, just like the climate scientists said we were, and people who are hoping that it's not going to be a big deal are going to be quite disappointed.
Yeah, in fact, I think the World Meteorological Organization put out a report on Election Day that said the last 5 years were, is that correct? The last 5 years were the hottest on record?
Yeah. Well, if you take the last 5 years together, then that would be the hottest 5-year period on record.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right, not that each year was understood. Okay, so this planet is getting hotter, whatever the deniers say, and we have talked. You and I think the last time we talked was after the latest set of agreements on climate change and on the environment. How does it look now with the election of Donald Trump?
Well, I think just as probably your listeners are in general shock about a lot of issues, the climate is one to be very concerned about. The Donald Trump campaign not merely on stopping and reversing U.S. climate action, but in pulling out of and trying to actually kill the Paris Climate Agreement from last December, which was 200 nations unanimously agreeing to constantly ratchet down their carbon pollution to keep total warming below 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit total warming from pre-industrial levels. It was always going to be a challenge. I think it is safe to say that if U.S. is actively, pulls out and actively trying to subvert it, it's going to be pretty much a long shot.
Okay, and let's talk about that for a second, because step number one in the Trump agenda is to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. What are you thinking of when you talk about subverting it?
Well, look, he is friends with Vladimir Putin. I mean, there are other countries out there that let's just say climate change is not one of their top priorities. Russia has a lot of fossil fuels. Its climate commitment was quite lame. It's still coasting off of the collapse of its economy back in the early 1990s. So, Vladimir Putin pulled out of the World Court today. I don't know if you saw that in the press. Is he going to pals up with Trump and are we going to get the collection of nations like, Saudi Arabia and others who might not be thrilled with this agreement? I don't know. I know that for 8 years in the George W. Bush administration, the Bush team actively tried to undermine international negotiations. Now, it's good, in Marrakesh, the countries of the world, the other signatories have stood up and said, climate change is serious and we're not backing down and we're going to keep going forward. I hope they give it their best shot. But we're the richest country in the world. We have a lot of influence and power over a lot of countries. And I don't know that he can kill the Paris Agreement. But remember, the point of the Paris Agreement was that the commitments that are already made only go through about 2025 or 2030. So they can't get us to safe levels of warming. The treaty says every 5 years, countries are going to come back with a lower set of targets. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to keep doing that over and over again. Because ultimately, the world has to go to zero sometime in the second half of the century if there's any chance for the planet. So this was just a first step. It's the U.S. commitment didn't put us anywhere near the safe path. And so if you see what I'm saying, the other countries of the world are going to meet their commitments. I have no doubt about it. And frankly, we will come relatively close, depending on how hard Trump tries to jack up carbon pollution. But nonetheless, we have to negotiate tougher commitments 5 years from now. And if the richest country in the world says, screw it, there are countries out there that are like, well, I don't know what I'm going to put on the table if they're not going to put something on the table. So I can't tell you, what will happen. Hopefully the European Union and China will, work together the way that U.S. and China work together for Paris to get other countries to make commitments, and just hope that they can weather this Donald Trump storm, and that they're be hoping for what progressives are hoping for. This is a one-term president, and that his damage can be somehow minimal. But if Donald Trump is a two-term president and he keeps to his commitment of doing everything he can to thwart climate action and to jack up carbon pollution, that's going to be very difficult for the rest of the world to handle.
So there are a couple issues here, as I understand it, Joe Romm, editor of Climate Progress. One is that when you have a plan like this, which requires the world to get tougher in 5-year increments in order to really reverse some potentially devastating trend lines, if that stops, we're in deep trouble. And I want to talk about that in a second. But if the next iteration of that is due 5 years from the first one, which is roughly about 4 years from now, still in the Trump sphere, or under Trump's influence, that if you miss that, let's say, leaving aside Trump's potentially aggressive efforts to subvert the deal and increase carbon pollution, that if you just miss that next deadline, you're that much deeper in the hole when it comes to really bringing it to zero by the second half of the century, because you've lost another 5 years.
Yeah, and remember, we're the second biggest polluter. China passed us about 5 years ago. So we are a substantial portion of emissions. And, as it's pretty darn clear, there are powerful forces in this country, the fossil fuel industry, which gets hundreds of billions of dollars of revenues just in this country alone, very well funded, has backed a well-funded effort to spread disinformation, to buy or gain the support of members of Congress and of right-wing disinformation media outlets and nonprofits. So, it's under the best of circumstances, Obama had to bypass Congress to use the Clean Air Act, which was, a long time ago, Congress passing a law saying that you can regulate pollutants that are dangerous to human health and well-being. So Congress had to use the EPA to bypass intransigent Congress to put in place this Clean Power Plan to regulate existing utilities. So that was how he was able to make a strong enough commitment to get a deal with the Chinese that was enough to bring all the other countries on board to Paris. And so that was the good news. But, again, if the U.S. gets off that train of steadily declining emissions and even worse starts going back up, then, it not only throws a roadblock for everyone else, but it just makes us that much harder for the U.S. to get back on the train of getting back to zero.
Right, and let's talk about that for a second too, Joe Romm. If you were saying that we really need to get to zero by the second half of the century to avoid, I think you put it, for the survival of the planet. Tell us what happens if we don't get to zero by the second half of the century.
Well, if we don't, then we are going to miss this 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degree Fahrenheit total warming target and potentially miss it by a lot because there are all these carbon cycle feedbacks like the frozen permafrost, which has huge amounts of carbon in it that as the planet warms up, carbon gets emitted from the tundra in Russia and Alaska and Canada. So the great danger is that if you don't stay below the threshold, then you cross over these tipping points that you mentioned earlier. One of these tipping points would be the loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet. So, much higher sea level rise than we thought. Another tipping point could be this carbon cycle feedback where you get the permafrost defrosting and all that sort of frozen vegetation starts giving off carbon and methane, and that just takes you a spiral up to higher warming. So, there's no one who can tell you what the exactly safe level is. It's just clear over the last 3 or 4 years, the scientific community has said anything over 2 degrees Celsius is really dangerous. The more you can stay away from it, the less likely you are to have a big tipping point like losing the West Antarctic ice sheet. The more you go over it, the more you're going to speed up all of these feedbacks that threaten, pretty serious consequences. And the other key word here, while I'm not cheering up your viewers, is irreversible.
Right.
Almost all of the major climate impacts are irreversible. And on a scale of hundreds of years, perhaps to 1,000 years. In other words, it's hard to melt something as big as Greenland or Antarctica, but once you start that process, it's even harder to, refreeze things. As you can imagine, you have an ice cube sitting on your radiator. As it starts to melt, you can turn that radiator off, but the radiator is still warm. Right. So you want to cool the radiator down. That is a whole different task, which is just not possible because the oceans are the reservoir of most of the heat. And, like in your bathtub, when you're in your bathtub really, really hot, the only way to cool it down is to add really, really cold water. Turning off the faucet doesn't cool it down except really, really slowly. So the point is, we are headed towards a series of dangerous tipping points and feedbacks which are irreversible, which is why, no rational or moral country would even risk it. And it's why, 199 other countries, including countries like China and South Korea and Mexico and Indonesia and Brazil, as well as all of the EU, signed on to doing this because it's just crazy to run this experiment on the planet and see what happens.
And I want to get to that in just a second because I think, what you're saying, Joe Romm, is basically that, the kinds of consequences you're describing lead to toxic, as I understand it, to toxic air, to potentially 100 million refugees from coastal areas, flooding, maybe lower Manhattan flooded. I'm not sure we know the details, but really apocalyptic, semi-apocalyptic, rough scenarios. But I want to talk about the shorter term too, because you wrote a piece for Think Progress, for Climate Progress, saying that the U.S., and this gets to the list of countries you just named who have signed on to this, that the U.S. will become a pariah if, or rather when Mr. Trump pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement. If we could just talk about that for a second, it might be helpful.
Sure. So two things. Yes. I mean, there's a TV series I'm involved with, Years of Living Dangerously, on the National Geographic Channel. It airs Wednesdays at 10 o'clock, and we've been going through the solutions and the optimism there, but also the dangers. And we have a segment with Jack Black in episode 2 in Miami. And yes, as you tweak up the warming, it gets harder and harder to save more and more of, let's say, South Florida. So let's say we're not going to be able to save Miami Beach and the Florida Keys. Let's just say we dawdled too long. But the question is, are we actually going to be able to save Miami proper? Are we going to be able to save Houston? Are we going to, and of course, other countries, they're poorer. You can look at low Bangladesh. So, yes, we are edging closer to tipping points that we're going to flood 100 million people out. And then, we're talking in the worst case scenarios, 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. So yes, the danger, is very real. Your point, yes, the point I made in the piece is that this isn't just a long-term threat. I think people don't appreciate how much of U.S. influence and power has been built around the fact that we're generally perceived as the good guys.
Right.
And we're the safe haven. The dollar is strong. People trust our treasury bills, because they know we're going to pay stuff back. And we're a democratic country with 200 years of bedrock principles. And so people in general look to us as a country that leads towards good things. Now, you and I know we don't always do good things, but the point is we certainly try, and I think the conception of America is we are trying to create progress and democratization around the world. If all of a sudden we become the country that out of the entire world pulls out of and tries to kill, frankly, the world's last best hope at averting catastrophe, particularly catastrophe for countries that had very little to do with this in the first place, right? Because many of the countries that are going to suffer the most are poor, and Bangladesh, they didn't contribute at all. So you can imagine how the rest of the world's going to start viewing us. They're not going to see us as the indispensable nation that they want to partner with and all this stuff. We switch over to a country kind of like Putin's Russia,
Right.
which is doing bad things in the world and making life harder for everybody. And I'm not here to tell you I know the future for certain. All I know is that is a world very different. You may want to get a foreign policy expert on to ask them, what happens when the U.S. has no soft power?
I think I will, actually. I think that's a great suggestion, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I wish it were on a more cheerful note. I guess the best case scenario, we get a Congress in there to start slowing them down in 2018. It's a long haul, and a different president in 4 years. But Joe Romm, a climate expert, editor of Climate Progress, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.